One of the quiet assumptions of modern forestry is that readiness can be measured with instruments: diameter at breast height, growth rate, moisture content, market class. Trees are reduced to data points, and the decision to cut is made on paper long before a saw touches bark. What is rarely acknowledged is that for most of human history, carpenters and woodsmen made the same decision without tools, charts, or formal measurements. They relied on sight, experience, and an understanding of how a tree lived in its landscape. The result was not guesswork. It was a disciplined form of judgment that often produced timber better suited for long-term use than much of what is harvested today. This episode looks at how carpenters once knew a tree was ready, not in the sense of economic maturity, but in the sense that mattered to people whose buildings, tools, and lives depended on that wood behaving predictably for generations. A tree was judged as a life history, not as a standing object. Traditional carpenters did not evaluate a tree in isolation. They read it as a record of years of stress, growth, and adaptation. The trunk, branches, bark, and crown were all treated as evidence. A straight trunk alone was never enough. A tree that grew too fast, too sheltered, or too evenly could be just as problematic as one that struggled. Growth rings were anticipated before the tree was cut. A wide, uniform crown often meant rapid growth and a softer wood, you know. A slightly constrained crown, shaped by wind or competition, suggested slower, denser growth. Carpenters learned to associate external form with internal structure through long experience, reinforced by the success or failure of previous projects. This way of seeing required time in the forest. It really could not be learned from diagrams. Apprentices followed masters not just to learn how to cut, but how to observe. Bark told carpenters more than most modern buyers realize. Bark texture, thickness, and pattern were among the first indicators carpenters examined. In many species, deeply furrowed bark suggested age and slower growth. Thin, smooth bark often pointed to youth or rapid expansion. But the interpretation was species-specific. What mattered was deviation from the norm. Uneven bark thickness around the trunk could indicate internal tension or reaction wood. Spiral patterns hinted at twisted grain. Areas where bark appeared stretched or cracked in unusual ways suggested past stress, frost damage, or sudden growth spurts. Carpenters paid close attention to how bark responded to the weather, you know. Trees that shed their bark cleanly or showed signs of fungal intrusion were often avoided, even if the wood looked perfectly sound from a distance. These judgments were quite intentionally conservative by design. After all, a failed beam cost much more than just the loss of a single tree. The shape of the crown, interestingly enough, revealed how the tree had lived. A tree that had grown alone, with branches evenly distributed, often produced wood with wide growth rings and, less structural strength. Trees that had fought for light, shedding lower branches early, tended to produce straighter, tighter-grained timber. Asymmetrical crowns mattered. A tree that leaned into prevailing winds developed compression wood or tension wood, depending on species. Experienced carpenters knew how this wood would behave when cut. The key was not perfection, but predictability. A tree that told a clear story was preferred over one that appeared flawless but unreadable. Seasonal cues, mattered as much as size or age. Leaf color, bud formation, and sap behavior all well factored into the decision. In many traditions, trees were cut only after leaves had fallen and before sap rose in spring. This was not superstition. Dormant trees contained less free moisture and fewer nutrients that attracted insects. The wood dried more evenly and, honestly, resisted decay longer. Cutting a tree at the wrong time of year can lead to some pretty unfortunate outcomes. Even if the wood seems top-notch, it could warp or rot just because of that timing. Some carpenters, they took things a step further. They started observing multi-year patterns. It's fascinating, really. A drought year followed by a wet year would yield wood with different characteristics than if you had a series of moderate seasons. And you see, these subtleties, they stuck around in people's minds because, well, failures were remembered. It's those lessons from the past that really shaped their understanding. Looking did not mean standing still. Carpenters struck trunks with the back of an axe or a wooden mallet and listened. A clear, resonant sound suggested dense, healthy wood. A dull response could indicate internal decay or excessive moisture. They also watched how a tree moved in the wind. Excessive sway in a mature tree suggested weak fiber structure or shallow rooting. A tree that flexed and returned smoothly was often preferred. These observations were integrated, not isolated. No single sign decided a tree's fate. Readiness was a convergence of indicators. A critical difference between traditional and modern evaluation is that readiness depended on intended use. A carpenter selecting timber for roof beams looked for different signs than one choosing wood for tool handles or ship planking. A slightly curved trunk might be useless for framing, but ideal for knees in shipbuilding. Reaction wood that was undesirable in one context was prized in another. Readiness was therefore relational. The tree was judged against a future role, not a generic standard. This purpose-driven selection reduced waste and increased performance. It also required deep material knowledge. A carpenter who misunderstood wood behavior paid the price in failure, sometimes years later. Traditional carpenters understood that a tree's readiness was shaped by its neighbors. Trees growing on the edge of a stand behaved differently from those in the interior. Soil depth, slope, and drainage all left marks on the wood. Selective cutting preserved forest structure and ensured future supply. Removing the best trees indiscriminately was recognized as short-sighted. Many traditions favored taking trees that had reached a plateau in quality, not those still improving. This perspective aligns closely with survivalist thinking. Sustainability was not an abstract ethic. It was a practical necessity for communities that could not import replacement materials. As forestry industrialized, the carpenter's eye was replaced by the forester's table. Efficiency improved, but, nuance was lost. Trees are now cut when they meet economic thresholds, not when their wood has reached optimal structural maturity. The result is wood that often requires chemical treatment, engineered reinforcement, or, rapid replacement. This shift also broke the feedback loop. Builders no longer see the long-term consequences of harvesting decisions. The forest and the finished structure are separated by markets and time. Understanding how carpenters once judged readiness is not about rejecting modern tools. It's really about recovering a way of thinking that treats materials as histories rather than just commodities. For those interested in resilience, self-reliance, or long-term construction, this perspective offers, practical guidance. A person who can read a tree can make better decisions with fewer resources. They can select wood that lasts longer, behaves more predictably, and requires less intervention. These skills are, really transferable across different contexts, from small-scale building all the way to land stewardship. Remembering how carpenters used to tell when a tree was ready actually matters, because it reminds us that some forms of knowledge are really earned through attention and accountability over time. They are not obsolete. They're simply incompatible with systems that, value speed over durability. If you value this kind of careful, historically grounded analysis, consider subscribing to Old World Timber Tricks. And if this episode added depth to how you think about wood, forests, and long-term preparedness, share it with others who appreciate learning that goes, beyond surface explanations.